This week, Finance Minister Colm Imbert will deliver his 10th national budget presentation. He will deliver it to a national population that is frustrated with the cost of living and the 4% increase for public servants still very much fresh in their minds. What can the public expect in Finance Minister Colm Imbert's 10th budget presentation, especially with an election on the horizon? My guest this week is former independent senator and economist, Amrita Deonarine. Amrita Deonarine, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Finance Minister Colm Imbert is on the eve of delivering what will be his 10th budget presentation, an achievement in itself. But what state is Trinidad and Tobago's economy in?
Well, Ryan, what I would say is that before we even take into consideration the state of the economy today, we need to look at it in the context of the challenges we have experienced over the past 5 to 7 years. And we need to be considerate of the fact that we have experienced a cumulative contraction of 23.7% in GDP. And the state of the economy today is reflective of those challenges that we would have experienced over the past 5 to 7 years. So what I could say is that based on CSO up-to-date statistics, which is up-to-date to the third quarter of 2023, we really haven't experienced any real growth for that first 3 quarters of 2023. And most of and this is primarily because of the energy sector having experienced some significant contraction. And also we have been having the non-energy sector driving some significant growth at around 5.8%.
You're looking at, when you say those challenges, you're specifically speaking to the global energy prices of oil and gas.
Correct. The global energy prices has been very volatile and even more volatile since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, making it very difficult to forecast. And therefore, it's difficult to predict when a pandemic is going to happen. It's difficult to predict Russia-Ukraine war breaking out, even the tensions in the Middle East right now. And all of these would have had resulted in supply chain disruptions that would have affected energy prices and in turn affected the energy revenues for Trinidad and Tobago.
Let's talk about those 2 crises that you mentioned. First of all, the pandemic, because you yourself mentioned the last 5 to 7 years and the contractions of the economy and the challenges that came with it. Has Trinidad and Tobago's economy rebounded as other economies have rebounded around the world post-pandemic?
What I would say at this point is that we have experienced some growth since the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we have not, the recovery is somewhat incomplete because we have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, both in the energy and the non-energy sectors.
But you yourself have admitted that even pre-pandemic, the numbers were not encouraging.
Correct. And even before the pandemic, what we would have experienced is some 10 to 11% decline in the economy between 2010 to 2019. 2019 was unique because in 2019 we started to see some growth, real growth, filtering through the economy. However, when COVID-19 happened, those efforts were somewhat reversed because it was a whole completely different situation with energy prices having declined and had caused significant revenue challenges for Trinidad and Tobago.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict, that in and of itself should have helped Trinidad and Tobago's economy or selling of oil and gas, given that the price of oil skyrocketed, especially when Russia invaded Ukraine. Did we see those type of numbers?
Yeah, definitely. So what you would realize is that since 2015, since budgets we have had since 2015, we recorded 1 fiscal surplus, and that would have been around the year when the Russia-Ukraine crisis would have happened. However, the growth that we experienced, the energy windfalls that we received then, it contributed to a budget surplus and a primary surplus then. However, that was
Short-lived.
short-lived.
It was
yes,
short. Yes,
yeah.
it didn't happen as long as some might have hoped.
Correct.
Let's move on a little bit to the finance minister's budgets. He has been able to present 10 budgets as of Monday. He will have presented 10 budget presentation, which is an achievement in and of itself for a finance minister in this country. Have you noticed any trends from Finance Minister Colm Imbert in between 2015 and 2024?
What I would say is that the Minister of Finance would have had to consistently deal with a situation of strained public finances. So it was a situation of trying to constantly ensure that debt doesn't explode and ensure that we maintain a reasonable fiscal deficit while it was recognized that we had to run a deficit. And it was along the lines of mostly fiscal consolidation. So since 2015 to now, the economy has been undergoing some sort of fiscal consolidation, which is basically you cutting off expenditure and trying to manage with less revenues.
Has the finance minister been too conservative in his budget presentations, particularly in pegging the budget to the oil and gas price?
What I would say is that forecasting of energy prices is a little bit of a difficult exercise. While there is room for improvement in the forecasting methodology that the Minister of Finance adopts, we need to take into consideration the fact that, look, it's only so much that we can forecast the energy prices, and there will be situations where deviations would occur. And when these deviations occur, they are entirely tied to geopolitical and global factors. Now, it's important with taking that into consideration, it is important to understand that given those challenges, we should try to not rely entirely on point forecasts or consensus forecasts. We need to adopt a better methodology in terms of forecasting the prices of oil and gas on which the budget is pinned. We need to take into consideration the fact that we need to make contingency plans in forecasting energy prices. So, for example, while it is understood that there are going to be deviations and there are going to be fluctuations in commodity prices, in energy prices, especially for countries that are highly reliant on these commodities for their major sources of revenues. But what we need to do as well is to have some sort of contingency plan in place. Now, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, usually a contingency plan could be a sovereign wealth fund. But what we would have realized is that throughout the years, since 2015, we have continuously utilized the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to help finance the budget deficits, right? If we look at a cumulative figure, we're looking about $12 billion that would have been withdrawn from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, TT dollars. And what I would say is that while that is one contingency plan, it should be looked as a contingency plan in the short term, and it cannot be seen as a measure for long-term dependency on withdrawing from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. But with that being said, I think it's also important to recognize how important the buffers from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund were during these challenging times that we have experienced. Because what it has allowed us to do is, because we had that alternative or that buffer compared to other countries, we were not severely hit by the pandemic as other countries would have been. So, for example, we had a situation where the public debt the deficit could have been significantly larger than where it is. The public debt could have been significantly higher than what it actually is right now. I think right now, as of the second quarter of 2024, it's around 74% of GDP.
Up next, with ministries under fire for the state of schools and national infrastructure, we talk recurrent expenditure. Is it a case of using the finance that is available more efficiently, or is it just that these ministries are simply not getting sufficient money? Let's talk a little bit about the monies that are allocated to various ministries across the government. Most of that money, it might sound a lot in Minister Imbert's budget presentation, but a lot of that goes to recurrent expenditure, things like maintenance, things like paying salaries, etc., purchasing goods and services on a day-to-day basis. Do we need to know, when we see the headlines of the education ministry not repairing sufficient schools or not enough is being done, and the Minister of Finance rebuts and say, well, the finance isn't really there, we need a lot more finance? Is it a case of using the finance that is available more efficiently, or is it just that these ministries are simply not getting sufficient money to both pay its recurrent expenditure on a month-to-month basis, but also do the work that the ministry is supposed to be doing?
I'm glad that you recognize that, Ryan, because it is a difficult balancing act to balance or to maintain. Because on one hand, you have the Minister of Finance that is trying to engage in fiscal restraint or fiscal consolidation, trying to contain the levels of expenditure because of the lower levels of revenues that has been received. And we continue to receive until the economy diversifies. And at the same time, what we are seeing happening is that these ministries are complaining that they are not receiving the necessary funds to carry out or to maintain their day-to-day scenarios, right, or their day-to-day operations. Now, this is a very, very tricky situation from a development perspective, because what ends up happening is that you resort to a bare maintenance scenario in the public service, which eventually leads to a situation where you find there is some sort of deterioration in public service. But it is something that would, I hope, force ministries to utilize funds in a more efficient manner. And with the full proclamation and operationalization of the Public Procurement Act, I am hoping that would feed into some additional efficiency within these ministries in the way in which they approach in doing more with less.
When you end up in a scenario like this, you can't help but question the growth of the economy, or lack thereof, when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago. And that's where growth becomes very critical.
Correct.
So in the absence of that growth, where is the growth going to come from?
And you are correct, because the reason we are in this situation where we are trying to have this sort of balancing act and also engage in this fiscal consolidation where we are trying to cut expenditure, but lo and behold, what ends up happening is that we really try and then we still come back at the mid-year review and we need to have a supplementation. What tends to happen is that if it is the economy was growing, we probably would not have been in this situation. The economy continues to be reliant on the energy sector for 80% of its exports. Even though it counts for 1/3 of its GDP, 1/3 of the country's GDP, it's still the energy sector is what mainly drives the economy at the moment. And this is where our diversification strategy comes into play, because really and truly, where is the growth going to come? We have been hearing since very many years we need to diversify the economy. But what we need to understand is that in the interim of reaping the benefits of both fiscal consolidation and the reforms, the deep-rooted reforms that are being made to diversify the economy, such as you have the TTRA, public procurement, you have also the Gambling, Gaming and Control Act that was also passed, We also have rationalization of expenditure. We have the transformation of state bodies. All those things are happening, but it is not yet showing fruit where we can engage in higher levels of expenditure. The growth, and this is where the growth strategy comes into play, and I would want to bring in Vision 2030. Now, the assumption that I am making is that every time the Minister of Finance reads a budget, it is being read in the context of that longer term strategy for the country, which is the Vision 2030 strategy. And also, if you would notice, he always makes mention of something called a medium-term policy framework. Now, this medium-term policy framework is what really he has been using informally to establish these different targets. We establish growth targets, debt targets, inflation targets, and so on, right? However, it not being deeply anchored into some sort of legislation or create some sort of fiscal rule with it, then the dedication or the commitment to remain on a diversification path to get to that growth that we need would be very difficult.
I also want to talk a part B with this question of growth within the economy. In the absence of the growth that we speak of, we've seen the finance minister have to slowly remove some of the subsidies, even of a percentage of the subsidies that Trinbagonians enjoy, be it electricity that is oncoming, the fuel subsidy that has been removed on a number of occasions. Do you think we can expect more of the same in this budget presentation? And I must add onto that, it is an election budget.
What I would say is that it has to happen at some point, regardless of it being an election budget. It may not happen this year. It may happen in the coming years.
The country simply cannot sustain it, you're saying, whether it's now, whether it's PNM, UNC, or any alternative party, the country can't sustain it.
The country can't sustain it, and the only alternative is either to continue to drain the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, or increase the deficits, which would automatically mean that we're going to be increasing our borrowing, which is also at the soft debt target that the Minister of Finance has established, which is around 75% of GDP. And what risk that would bring is with our credit rating. Now, it's important to understand this because given the fiscal consolidation path that the Minister of Finance had gone down over the past years, what it has allowed us to do is maintain our investment credit rating with international credit rating agencies. Now, our investment grade is lower than it was in 2015, but we are still one of the countries in the Caribbean, one of the few countries, the only country as a matter of fact in the Caribbean that is rated as an investment grade. And that is very important to have that international credit worthiness in order so that we can qualify for external borrowing. Now, I'm not saying that, we need to go and borrow externally. What I'm saying is that it's good to have, and it is one very favorable thing to have Trinidad and Tobago to maintain its investment rating.
Coming up next, a budget as an election beckons. How much of an influence do you think this election will have on this budget? Get away from the fact that an election is due next year. What do you think? How much of an influence do you think this election will have on this budget?
I think that given that the projections for economic growth is basically slow for the next 2 years until we reap some significant gains from the energy sector.
Dragon gas deal,
correct.
cooking a mannequin.
Correct. And in the interim, while we wait on the non-energy manufacturing sector to catch up, because we have been experiencing some growth there, but it is not enough yet to compensate for the high levels of exports or net exports that we receive from the energy sector. I would expect that maybe there might be some sort of laid-back approach in tackling the reduction of subsidies in this budget.
When we look at some of the ministries that have gotten the largest chunk out of the budget presentations, Education Ministry, National Security Ministry, and there have been critics saying that these ministries are getting large sums of money, but we're not seeing the impact. And it sort of ties back into the effectiveness of the use of the money that you and I were speaking about a little bit earlier in our conversation. But the large sums of money that the National Security Ministry gets, the Education Ministry gets, while it is important, as a former independent senator yourself, is it correct to give these ministries such a large chunk? And the criticism, is the criticism fair?
The criticism warrants some explanation because, I mean, we have been increasingly allocating additional amounts to these entities, and therefore, we have not been seeing the benefits that should accrue from these additional investments into these ministries. What needs to be done is a clear explanation needs to be given what chunk of these monies allocated is going towards recurrent expenditure and what is going towards developmental expenditure for these entities. Now, I say that because I do not believe that we should be cutting back, but at the same time, I feel like we need some sort of transparency as to why we have not been seeing benefits from these, or the entire population have not been reaping any benefits from this additional investments into both the Education Ministry and also the Ministry of National Security. We have seen crime go out of control. We have seen a large school dropout rate in schools. We have seen a deteriorating literacy rate amongst our students. We have also been seeing the performance of students in maths, English, CXC, and so on declining. So the big question is that, look, while we are allocating these monies to these ministries, then really and truly, rather than ask for it to be cut back, I think we should be asking for more explanations as to why the expenditure has not been reaping the benefits that we need to see to improve our economy from both a social aspect and also from a labor market perspective.
Or at least demand that better efficiency and more fruits, as you call it, be reaped because of the investments that are being made in this ministry. I do want to talk about the cost of living very quickly before we end. Inflation rate in Trinidad and Tobago, the cost of living has been the subject of much discussion throughout the tenure of Finance Minister Colm Imbert. We've seen the 4% increase in salaries be the subject of much criticism. Can we expect any ease in the cost of living over the next fiscal year?
What I would say is that the cost of living, the international inflation, international prices, commodity prices have been on a decline. And they have, even though they have been on a decline, but still higher than pre-pandemic levels. Now, what that means for Trinidad and Tobago is that we tend to not see that transmission and decline in prices happening in Trinidad and Tobago yet. It usually takes about 2 to 3 years, sometimes even less of a time. It takes usually 1 to 2 years for that transmission mechanism to be filtered into developing countries like Trinidad and Tobago. Now, with that being said, what we need to be cognizant of is that the rise in prices in Trinidad and Tobago has been impacting households a lot. And we need to be very clear that the reason why the population has been reeling so much from higher and increased cost of living and food prices is because we have a labor market that basically their income levels are very low. So if you recall a couple budgets ago when the Minister of Finance would have announced an increase in the income tax threshold for the population from $7,000 to $7,500. And when he made that announcement, he mentioned that, look, this is going to benefit some 300,000 persons in the labor force. Our labor force is approximately 609,000 persons. So you have 300,000 persons that are earning an income below $7,500, right? And then we had the increase in the minimum wage last year in the last budget. And that increase in the minimum wage benefited 190,000 people. Now, bear in mind, our labor force is 609,000 persons. So if you run the numbers, you really and truly would see that less than 20% of the labor force is earning a salary above $7,500. And that is a cause for concern. So the reason now, and another cause for concern is that while, yes, we are complaining about high inflation prices, but on the other hand, the inflation metrics are showing that, look, inflation has basically declined from 8.5% in 2022 to a very low level to date. I think it's around, I can't remember the number, but it has declined since 2022. But we're still hearing persons complain about the rise in food prices. Food price inflation has increased, but general core inflation has been on a downward trajectory. This begs the question, really and truly, where are the inflation numbers reflective of the current consumption basket of goods that the regular Trinidad and Tobagonian consumes? And this takes me straight back to the whole methodology that is used to calculate inflation, right? Because really and truly, the inflation methodology that is used right now is based on an outdated basket of goods, based on a household budgetary survey way back in 2008. So really and truly, I think there is some underrepresentation of the true level of inflation in the country, and therefore, which is why we see this sort of mismatch between the metrics that is being given and what we are hearing from the public, taking also into consideration the fact that, look, the wages of the labor force is really on the lower end as opposed to the higher end. And this brings me back straight to the growth strategy, right? Our growth strategy needs to start at investing in people. While we need to also address the binding constraints to growth, and the two most binding constraints to growth right now is crime and accessibility of foreign exchange. Because really and truly, what we need to do is we need to create jobs. We know the public sector cannot create those jobs, right? Because the public sector already has a very fat public sector wage bill. We need to encourage the private sector to create those jobs. But is the private sector incentivized to do so? If the private sector is, and I don't think the private sector is entirely incentivized to do so, because they are dealing with numerous challenges. They are dealing with the challenge, even though there have been multiple incentives coming across many budgets to help the non-energy sector, to help the private sector, the non-energy manufacturing sector. We are seeing improvement in the non-energy manufacturing, but there's also the rest of the private sector that we are not talking about. And that sector is where we need to understand what are the challenges that they are facing if we are to expect them to expand growth, expand hiring, and create jobs. We need to understand the business environment in which they are dealing with. We need to understand the challenges that they're dealing with. And we need to address those challenges to get to a point where we could see meaningful growth taking place.
Amrita Deonarine, thank you very much for your time.